as a writer, the work that I could see as being really important was to show Native people as they are today, but to provide the context for some of what we're dealing with, some of the challenges.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Native Minnesota, a podcast about the Native American experience in Minnesota and beyond. I'm your host, Rebecca Crook-Stratton, Secretary-Treasurer of the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community. Today on the podcast, we have Diane Wilson, a writer, speaker, and educator who is a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe in South Dakota. Her latest novel, The Seed Keeper, was released by Milkweed Editions last spring. We had a great conversation about telling Native stories, seed keeping, and food sovereignty. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, Diane. Welcome to the podcast. We're so excited you could join us today. I'm here with Diane Wilson, author, among many other things, and excited about our conversation today. So you write both fiction and nonfiction about Dakota people, Dakota issues, Dakota stories. Can you talk a little bit about your background and how you got into writing?
Well, thank you, Rebecca. It's really wonderful to be here, and I'm really grateful for the invitation to have the conversation today. So my background is, I was thinking about this morning. I really come to writing as a reader. So one of my earliest memories was just trying to puzzle out words, trying to access the stories that I knew were locked away behind books and in the beginning, really behind the the comic pages in the newspaper was my earliest inspiration. But as I grew older, then seeing the gaps in the books that were out there and understanding as an adult what it means to not have books as a child that represent your story, your family story, a history that, unless you are motivated to dig it out later in life, it was not available to me as a child. So writing for me was a way of exploring questions that I had about cultural identity and about history and about assimilation and really about how do we undo some of the harms that have been done over many generations, and then wanting to bring those stories back to community so that both children and adults have stories available to them.
I think that's great and so important when you touched on identity and finding who you are. We just did a resource scan for educational resources in Minnesota and issued a report. But in so many cases, students, and especially our Native students, don't see themselves represented in really any of the materials throughout their K through 12 education. So I agree that is really important. Your first book was a memoir about your family and heritage. What was the big inspiration behind that, and how did you find all the information?
So the inspiration for me was growing up in Golden Valley, which is a suburb of Minneapolis, and knowing that my mother was Lakota and enrolled on the Rosebud Reservation. She spent 6 years at the Holy Rosary Mission School on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and her older sisters attended the St. Francis Mission School on Rosebud. And then here I was growing up in Golden Valley, and even as a child thinking, well, how did we go so far in one generation? And trying to understand what my mother's life was like, and she was not comfortable talking about it. And I think partly her generation and her parents' generation had learned that they had grown up with silence as one of their, I think, protective ways of surviving, so that it wasn't safe to talk about being Native in South Dakota. In some cases, it was too painful to talk about the experiences that they had been through. And so for her, she just wasn't comfortable telling those stories. And so that was a big motivation to me was to understand what was behind her silence. And she had told me a story when I was growing up about going home to Rapid City from the boarding school for a surprise visit and learning that her family had moved and she didn't know where they were. And she went back to boarding school for 2 years. And she wasn't bitter, which kind of amazed me. But she also didn't have any explanation for what had happened or why boarding schools existed or why her family was there. And so those were questions. So for me, that writing process became a way to really explore my family's history, first of all. And then as I went deeper into it, seeing how it wasn't just my family's experience, that I thought we had just made choices that ended up with us turning away from community. And it was through the research that I began to understand this much broader context of assimilation and the way that had worked across the country in Native communities. So for me, the research just started, you just pick a thread, when you're doing it, because it's overwhelming if you try to think about all that you don't know. So for me, the biggest question when I started was boarding schools. Why? What? Why was my family there? And I started with history, just learning all about boarding schools and why they were established. I went back to South Dakota and visited the places where my mother and my aunts grew up. We ended up having a family reunion out there and all going out together. So then it just went from there. It's like I kept pulling on that thread of, well, then boarding schools and land allotment and then eventually brought me back to the 1862 Dakota War and the removal of Dakota people and the impact that has had on generations since then.
The boarding school piece is really hard. And I think people don't realize how many of our families are directly affected by the experiences our parents and grandparents had. Both my grandparents, my dad's side, went to boarding schools, and same thing, they didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
And there was a lot of trauma there. And I think in some ways they were trying to save their children from having to go through similar experiences by not sharing their stories or not sharing culture and language and tradition with them to try to get to, an assimilated sort of stance so they could be successful in the Western world. And I think one of the things I'd like to talk a little bit about is assimilation. It's a term that we know very well here in Indian country for sure. But I think a lot of mainstream Americans don't understand assimilation or the process. Can you talk a little bit about some of the research and what that means for Indian communities?
Well, so assimilation really became the subtext of the memoir. So that it just as you were saying, when earlier generations tried to protect their children by giving up language and traditions and ceremonies and adapting to Western ways in I think an effort primarily to keep their children safe, because it had been, there were so many horrific events in history, too painful sometimes to talk about. But what I was seeing in writing that story is that whether you're sharing that history or not, that trauma is rolling forward through generations. And what happens is that later generations are inheriting some of the impact and imprint of that trauma, but they don't have the context for it. So there's no way to address it really or resolve it. So I found that if you go back and understand, first of all, the history. So let's say boarding schools. So you understand why they were set up, what that experience was like for generations, what happened to children when they came home, what happened to their children because they weren't being raised in a traditional household, they weren't learning how to parent. And then by sharing your own story, it helps address some of the shame and the trauma and the grief that so many families carry without really even understanding that if you don't have your family history. So the assimilation piece to me was told through the memoir. That's why I structured it the way I did, so that it was generations and it was two stories moving from back in time forward, and then my story here moving back to show that the way that assimilation, the impacts of all those programs rolls forward through generations.
Yeah, definitely. It still has a very significant impact on our communities today. And that leads to one of my next questions is about the invisibility of Native people. We really don't exist, especially as modern people, in mainstream media, pop culture, and many Americans, if they even know we still exist, know very little about us as modern people, and their images are more of the stereotypical, Western films and headdresses and stuff like that. So why is it important to focus on modern Dakota, Lakota people in your writing, and what do you think that does for kind of lifting that veil of invisibility?
Right before the pandemic settled in, I went to a conference and I went specifically to hear Crystal Echohawk talk about this very large study she did on Native communities across the country. And she said a phrase that really caught my attention, and hopefully I get this right. It was change the story, change the future. And it was all about addressing that invisibility of Native people in government, in literature, in all these aspects of modern day life. So to me, as a writer, the work that I could see as being really important was to show Native people as they are today, but to provide the context for some of what we're dealing with, some of the challenges. So I think of the way that Native youth have really struggled in terms of lower graduation rates and depression and really high rates of suicide. And I think there's a tendency sometimes for the media to just portray the dysfunction in Native communities. But unless you understand that broader context of trauma that has been transmitted across generations, then you don't understand why this was created. So I want to show in my writing and in my work that there is such a vibrant, dynamic, thriving Native community that continues to maintain and rebuild. And that to me is the critical message.
I agree. The resiliency of Native people, right?
Yeah.
I think, we all too often focus on some of the negative things, but there are so many amazing things going on in our community.
I think you have to know your history, but then you have to really focus on that rebuilding from the positive side. Relearning our languages, reclaiming our Indigenous foods, our traditions and our ceremonies, and that's what rebuilds our strength and our resilience, as you said.
And being able to do that all in a new and modern way, right?
Yeah.
The adaptability that our people have to move us forward. Yes, it is. It's inspiring. Our youth especially inspire me. So I'm going to switch directions a little bit. Your latest book is called The Seed Keeper. It was just released last year, and it won the 2022 Minnesota Book Award in Fiction. Congratulations on that. That's a wonderful accomplishment. Can you share a little bit about this book in particular?
Well, the book is, it is just, it was such a work of love for the the work I've been doing the past 20 years in working with organizations and farmers and seeds and then as a writer, I took what I've been learning for 20 years and as a gardener too. And I created a story about 4 Dakota women who are really struggling over several generations to maintain their values and their traditional life ways. And then to also show through the main character, Rosalie Ironwing, whose life has been hugely impacted by assimilation, that as she reclaims a relationship with seeds, which to me is really a metaphor for that very Indigenous way of believing that we are related to everything, all living beings in the world, that is the way that rebuilding that relationship then is what brings her home to her family and her community and then to the seeds themselves. So it certainly puts the framework across generations for what's happened to Dakota people going back to the 1862 Dakota War, but it's intended to really show that pathway is always the same. We return to our values, we return to our traditions, and it was to share that experience I've had of, we also do it by returning to our foods.
So you as a seed keeper, right? I think seed keeping is something that's always been around, especially in Native communities, right? You give them as gifts, and it's a way to keep things going. And seeds, we know have traveled across the continent in different trades to spread foods around. Can you talk a little bit about, seed keeping and especially maybe how it's changed today and why it's so important to Native communities and youth and the ability to learn from so many thyngs as a seed keeper?
So that phrase came from, I was introduced to it by an elder, Terry Lynn Brandt, who is one of the most amazing seed keepers I've met through food sovereignty work. And, because a more conventional phrase would be seed saving. But there's a very different implication. Seed saving, you're putting it away, you're saving it like you would in a bank, or the way that conventional seed programs save seeds for some indefinite time, or the way they create these vaults that are just storing seeds away, or sometimes, which really is hard to see, is finding seeds in museums where they're being treated as just an artifact and not a living being. And so seed keeping means you are holding responsibility for these seeds at this point in time but with an intentionality around that relationship that seeds have to be grown in order to be viable, and that you're keeping them for some period of time, maybe for the next season, maybe for a next generation. But the intention is always to maintain that relationship, that reciprocity that creates a relationship with seeds as essential to our survival, just as we return that gratitude back to them by taking care of them. So seed keeping is, to me, a really beautiful tradition that has taught so much to our families and was so important to our way of life. But it's also a beautiful metaphor too, in the way that we take care of our children, we take care of our families.
If you're looking to read more books by Native American authors, I encourage you to check out Diane Wilson's work. Her website is dianewilsonwords.com. Another great resource here in the Twin Cities is Birch Bark Books in Minneapolis. Owned by Native author Louise Erdrich, the store carries a ton of books about Native accomplishments, culture, and history. You can find them at birchbarkbooks.com. Now back to our episode. Well, as part of your career, you've been really involved in Native food issues. You were the executive director of the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, and also the executive director of Dream of Wild Health. Can you talk a little bit about these organizations and why you're passionate about that work?
They both are doing just incredible work of restoring Indigenous foods to communities and helping to rebuild the traditional foodways in a modern community, so that, as we say, we can't all go out hunting, for example, and we can't all go out foraging necessarily, but we can understand the essential importance of these practices and begin to rebuild as communities our independence and our sovereignty in restoring Indigenous foods to communities in a way that rebuilds our financial health, our physical health, our emotional health, our spiritual health. And I found food work to be right at the heart of really reclaiming cultural sovereignty. And so I learned so much in both organizations about seed keeping, about reciprocity, about some of the harder history around the ways in which communities were moved from traditional foodways onto reservations, and then the impact of commodity foods. And again, it's understanding that context that allows us to see the work that we need to do to rebuild that. And I've seen the youth programs, in particular at Dream of Wild Health, I've seen the transformational impact they have on youth. To be working with elders and to be on the land, to be working with seeds, and to be learning how to cook, and we had a saying that when you eat meals that are grown with loving care and then cooked with loving care, and then you share these meals of Indigenous foods, you are re-indigenizing from the inside out. So that was in both organizations the experience of seeing firsthand how our food work is fundamental to rebuilding the health of our communities. And it's joyful work because we all love a good meal. And so it builds community. We're sharing foods. We're rebuilding a practice that dates back thousands of years. So to me, food work is intrinsic to all of that cultural rebuilding process, along with our languages and our ceremonies. And, when we're growing those Indigenous foods, the way that our ancestors practiced, it brings back songs, it brings back prayers, it brings back that sense of reverence for this land and for our plants and for our water. That, to me, is also fundamental to what it means to be an Indigenous person.
I love that concept of, the garden to the cooking to the sharing a meal, re-indigenizing
yes.
The inside out.
Ernie Whiteman.
Oh, that's absolutely beautiful.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that. So we talk a little bit about food sovereignty in there, and I think food sovereignty is a term that has really gained momentum in the past decade or so. I know SMSC participated or had a campaign, Seeds of Native Health, that was really to raise awareness about the health disparities across Indian country. And one of the main reasons for those health disparities is, as you said, commodities and poor diets. And so that push to return to traditional foods and healthier natural foods is kind of all wrapped up in food sovereignty. And can you talk a little bit about that term specifically and some of the work around it and why it's important for our communities?
So my personal interpretation of food sovereignty is healthy children. If we have healthy children, then everything is working as it should be. But I think a broader understanding of it would be a community has the ability to provide healthy and culturally appropriate and affordable food for its members. So it's returning those traditional foods back as foods for community. And often part of this that's really important is the education piece, because what has been displaced over generations is that knowledge of how important our foods were, how to grow and harvest them and cook them, because it is a different palate in some ways. So the traditional corns, for example, don't have that same kind of sweetness that the sweet corn today does, which is more like a donut, it's a carb. And your traditional corn was much higher in protein and antioxidants. And so there's a shift that has to be made in reintroducing these foods to people's palates. But one of the things we did at Dream of Wild Health was actually test some of the indigenous seeds that we had and compare them to conventional foods. And those old seeds were so much higher in nutrition. So it really showed us how much has been traded off in terms of when you start hybridizing and genetically modifying seeds, especially if it's with the intention of shifting a growing season or increasing a yield without paying attention to what that seed was intended to do, which was to provide this nutritional value to families, then what we see is a food system now that's really geared towards profit. So that's your food as commodity, whereas your seed as a relative, you're going to take care of that relative. You're going to maintain what made that such an important food in the beginning and maintain it today, which is challenging in our food environment. But I feel like Native communities in particular are situated to lead this work, to return to food sovereignty as one of the ways of really increasing our independence as communities.
Yeah, and I know here in our community and many of the communities, we do have a focus on, our garden is called Wajupi. And
I love your garden.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a wonderful garden, but we operate, some similar programs as Dream of Wild Health, where we bring the children in and they get to learn about the garden and the traditional foods. And we've made an effort to grow more traditional foods like choke cherries and wild plums, and then to be able to harvest those and actually host classes around canning and preserving and recipes and being able to use and taste those things. So it is a wonderful process, and I'm glad that our tribal communities are focusing on that. What do you do in your garden? What are some of the things you do and some of your favorite recipes?
So I have it's not real big, but I have a seed garden, and I like to grow the Dakota corn that actually was a gift from Teresa Peterson to Dream of Wild Health. And then I have seeds from Dream of Wild Health that I grow out. And it's the same corn that I wrote about in The Seed Keeper. And it goes back to that story that I heard about Dakota women saving the seeds in the hems of their skirts after the 1862 Dakota War. And so for me, growing out that corn is a way of remembering the sacrifices they made to protect those seeds and how important it is for us, our generation, to maintain and protect those seeds going forward, even though we have access to all these other foods. But those Dakota women protected them so that we would have them today. So our generation and our children and our grandchildren would have those seeds today. So I grow that corn and traditional tobacco that was a gift from Ernie Whiteman, who was an elder at Dream of Wild Health. And so that's my real joy, is to grow out those old seeds. But then also, as we were talking earlier, I love greens. So, to see our traditional foods, but then to bring in the foods that we also adopt as part of a new diet, for like kale, for example, that's a great green. I've had kale over winter here in Minnesota, which is amazing. So, kale is a new plant, but it's a great food. And then I like growing fruit, the berries, I've got blueberries and raspberries, and, it's so just whatever I can grow that just helps me teach my grandchildren too, what these foods are, why they're important.
Those are great memories for children.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to shift away from food and food sovereignty a little bit and kind of move into writing and books. Is there anything you're working on right now?
So I'm kind of in the gestational gathering phase of, I think, what'll turn into a couple projects. One is thinking about the ways that there's when we're working with land and plants, I think there's an experience that we often have of, there's a lot of grief in that work as well, that because of so much is changing today with climate change, we're losing so many species. We're seeing so many areas that have been disturbed that, I think about the land that I live on that was used for grazing and has now been overrun by even native plants that have become overestablished. And so how do we do this work of land restoration, but how do we also tend our grief? And I think there's a way in which Indigenous people have a particular understanding of grief, both as it relates to the land, but also to our personal lives, that there isn't really a collection of that. So I'm interested in that topic, I'll say that. And then also another novel. And I think it'll be a continuation of The Seed Keeper, but focusing more on the two young men, because I think that there are challenges that our young men are facing that are unique to them and the losses that they've experienced over the generations. And so those are the things that I'm beginning to gather around. And I should say too, I have a children's picture book coming out in October with 3 other writers, and it's called Where I Come From. And the idea is to share stories from 4 very different communities that go back in time, but then also to your personal story. So again, it's a way of bringing a book back to children that shows that gives them some different stories to relate to.
I love that. It's great. I can't wait to pick it up and share it with my kids. I want to ask a little bit about what kind of advice do you have for non-Native people who want to learn more about Dakota culture and find some reputable books and find authors and resources that give a correct narrative?
Boy, for Dakota history and culture in particular, I think it's really important to know the history, and then both through nonfiction and fiction. I think you can pick up a lot both ways. And, maybe there's looking at what books do Native organizations carry, what books are being recommended on Native websites. So those are, and I would say the Birch Bark Books is a fantastic bookstore owned by Louise Erdrich. Incredible collection of Native books and Native authors. And that's one of the places that you can either visit or you can go to their website. And, I think, they also have very knowledgeable staff. So those are some of the resources that I would check.
Yeah. Birch Books is wonderful. And especially for educators, they'll help put together resources for different grade levels and stuff like that too. So.
And the Historical Society has also printed some pretty some really good books on Native history and culture. So I would also check their collection.
Then I guess on the other side, there are a lot of Native people out there that have wonderful stories to tell, right?
Yeah.
What kind of advice do you have for them, and how to get started as a writer, and how do they share their stories?
Yeah. And I have to say, I'm so glad you asked this, because that, for me, is one of the most important things we can be doing right now, is encouraging Native writers to tell Native stories. And you don't have to be, people put this thing in their mind like, oh, I don't know how to do this. Well, you learn to do it by sitting down with a notebook and a pen. And, there's all kinds of ways to develop craft, but the most important thing is to be telling those stories. So when I think back to that phrase I mentioned of Crystal Echohawk, the change the story, change the future, one of the ways we do that is by making sure that Native stories are being told by Native authors. So I had mentioned to you earlier about a program run out of All My Relations Gallery that actually we just concluded a 2-year pilot program for supporting Native writers, emerging Native writers who want to publish a book. And the focus was on developing a manuscript and then learning what is involved in publishing a book. So getting to know editors, understanding some of the grants you can apply for, and then what the whole process looks like. There's also a Native book club that I think it's Alicia Waka. And that is also a great way to get acquainted with Native authors, and also to be, it's also a way in which I think they're talking about doing a Native writers, just a Native writers group. So those are some of the resources that I know of that are happening right now.
Fantastic. So when you wrote your first pieces and were looking to get them published, what was maybe one of the largest barriers you faced in getting to that end stage where you finally had a published piece of work?
Believing that I could do it. I didn't, and that was part of my motivation in wanting to work with All My Relations and setting up that Native writers group, was I didn't have the resources, I didn't have the encouragement. I just had kind of a stubborn determination that I wanted to tell this story. I thought it was important. I thought I had a responsibility to tell it, to not be silenced by what had silenced earlier generations in my family. But what happens is that, that we need to encourage Native writers now. We need to support them and help them understand how important it is to tell those stories and how much healing there is in sharing your story. And then to make sure that we have those stories available for children, so that they're not waiting until they're an adult to learn who they are and what their history is. They're learning it as part of growing up in Minnesota and in this country.
Do you think it's much easier today than it was, say, even 10 years ago for Native authors to be able to publish their works?
I think it's definitely changing, because there's a lot more Native books out there right now and more coming out all the time. It's really exciting. So this is a terrific time to actually work on a book and get it out there, because there's a lot of interest from publishers and readers to understand more about Native culture and stories and history.
That's great. I always look forward to anything new by our Indigenous relatives that I can grab off the bookshelf. So, Diane, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your stories and your work with us. It's really inspiring. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. It's just been a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you for joining me for the Native Minnesota podcast. For more episodes, please subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also visit our website, understandnativemn.org, to learn more about our campaign's work to improve the Native narrative in Minnesota's public schools.